Thank you very much, Anne. Thank you also to Cecilia, Nina, Aaron, Omar, GRL Group for the fantastic graphics, and CCA and their interaction design program for having me here. It really is an honor to close out this series of talks. I'm going to be actually reading a speech, which is a little unusual because I usually try to speak a little more off the cuff or off notes, but I'm recovering from COVID and my brain is a little foggy, so I thought it might be safer to write down my remarks, and hopefully they're somewhat coherent. I'm going to touch on a lot of different subjects, and I'll be happy to attempt to go a little deeper on them following the talk in the chat. Soren Kierkegaard, oh, and sorry, thank all of you for tuning in on this. I appreciate your attendance and hope you enjoy the show. Soren Kierkegaard, around 1843, said what's often paraphrased as, "Life can only be understood backwards, it must be lived forwards." The full quote in translation runs, "It is really true what philosophy tells us, that life must be understood backwards. But with this, one forgets the second proposition, that it must be lived forwards. A proposition which, the more it is subjected to careful thought, the more it ends up concluding precisely that life at any given moment cannot really ever be fully understood, exactly because there is no single moment where time stops completely in order for me to take position to do this, going backwards." Much has changed since Kierkegaard wrote this at the dawn of electricity. We are capable of a lot more and a lot less now than we were then. And who knows what weird and wonderful and terrible things we will be able to do tomorrow. I'm going to be interspersing my comments with a lot of quotes here and there, and hopefully my voice will be the cue that I'm reading a quote. I don't typically use slides or backgrounds. If you get bored of looking at me, there's all kinds of stuff in the busy background. I do apologize to the group that did the graphic design, but apparently my computer's too old to allow me to put the graphics behind me, so we get what we get. I've heard Marshall McLuhan called a lot of things over the years, from theorist to charlatan, but I don't remember anyone calling him a designer. It's an interesting thought to consider him as a designer. What is a designer? Someone who has intent, someone who plans, who has a vision and acts, a visionary. Marshall McLuhan was intensely deliberate, though he's not often thought of or discussed that way, and it may be useful for designers to consider him in this light. He had an agenda or an effect which he wished to achieve, and he went about to try and achieve it. People who find him difficult to read and say he was an ironically poor communicator will not likely consider that his plans were quite deeper than writing books. I would argue that his plan or design is still working and having results. It's interesting to note that Marshall McLuhan began his university career in mechanical engineering. He was interested in the way things work, in design. It is also interesting to note that he left the engineering program at the University of Winnipeg after a year and went into English literature and was for his entire career an English teacher specializing in poetry. Marshall had several people he looked up to and borrowed liberally from in his work, though he usually gave credit where due. For example, in his introduction to Harold Innis's Bias of Communication, Marshall wrote that his own work was but a footnote to Innis. Likely the most often quoted author in all of Marshall's works is James Joyce, and the most often quoted work, Finnegan's Wake. Joyce called himself the greatest engineer of the 20th century, and Marshall, for his part, called his own work Applied Joyce. Another author Marshall drew from was Edgar Allan Poe. The story which Marshall brought up a lot was Edgar Allan Poe's A Descent into the Maelstrom. In the story, I encourage you to look it up, it's a short one. A fisherman and his brother get caught in a giant vortex in the ocean. It wasn't a surprise in that everyone knew about it and normally avoided it, but that day they were chasing a good school of fish and they went too close to be able to get back, so they got sucked in. The fisherman's brother lost his mind and jumped overboard in despair, but the hero of the story was of a different character. The maelstrom was huge, and as he circled around and around and around, and the initial terror wore off, he started to notice things, such as different objects which seemed to not be going down, but circling up. Because of this, he was able to tie himself to something buoyant, time it just right, jump into the vortex, and make his escape. Marshall used this story often to show how we might make a similar escape from our technological maelstrom. It's why he said such things as, "There is absolutely no inevitability as long as there is a willingness to contemplate the situation." In design and engineering, we make choices which have existential consequences. No pressure. If I'm being dramatic, it's because the situation warrants it. I don't suppose that in any part of a designer's education you will hear cautions like this, but perhaps you should. It was a friend of Marshall McLuhan's, John Culkin, who summed up his word with the statement, "We shape our tools, and thereafter our tools shape us." Designers shape the tools. Design with great care. Marshall also drew something else from Poe, aside from the descent into the maelstrom. And that's from Poe's character Dupin, the prototype of the modern detective fiction hero, and the notion of working back from effects to causes. In the typical detective novel, you begin with a corpus delicti, or a murder, or otherwise mystery, and it's the job of the detective to pick up clues and reconstruct events in order to solve the case to determine who done it. Marshall saw himself as an explorer in a new land. He tried to take this approach in his work so that he approached each situation with as few preconceptions as possible in order to have the widest perspective possible. The more preconceived notions you bring into any situation, the fewer chances you have of seeing all sides of it. Marshall likewise saw himself as a detective, entering the scene of the crime and trying to determine the events which led up to it. There's even some funny pictures of him from around 1973, dressed up like Sherlock Holmes with a deerstalker cap and a magnifying glass and a meerschaum pipe. Marshall did not hesitate to act the part. The medium is the message. For the content of a medium is like the juicy piece of meat carried by the burglar to distract the watchdog of the mind. Marshall McLuhan, Understanding Media, 1964. This quote from Understanding Media is taken from T.S. Eliot, who wrote, "The chief use of meaning in a poem, in the ordinary sense, may be, for here again I'm speaking of some kinds of poetry and not all, to satisfy one habit of the reader, to keep his mind diverted and quiet while the poem does its work upon him, much as the imaginary burglar is always provided with a nice piece of meat for the house dog. T.S. Eliot, The Use of Poetry and the Use of Criticism, 1933. It took me a long time to wrap my head around what this juicy piece of meat thing meant. What is supposedly happening while I'm busy with the content or considering the meaning of a poem? The answer to this question goes to the heart of what Marshall was getting at in understanding media in the first chapter, where that altered quote appears: "The medium is the message." In a culture like ours, he writes, long accustomed to splitting and dividing things as a means of control, it is sometimes a bit of a shock to be reminded that, in operational and practical fact, the medium is the message. This is merely to say that the personal and social consequences of any medium, that is, of any extension of ourselves, results from the new scale that is introduced into our affairs by each extension of ourselves or by any new technology. For the message of any medium or technology is the change of scale or pace or pattern that it introduces into human affairs. The main point being that these sorts of changes happen regardless of whether we're looking at the news on our phone or texting a friend or posting on Facebook. The changes happen because the phone has become indispensable, and that has happened while we're busy looking at the screen or trying to determine the relative bias of Fox versus CNN. Media literacy is of little help in understanding the effects of technology at any scale. Pulling in another quote from Marshall makes this a little more clear. The effects of new media on our sensory lives are similar to the effects of new poetry. They change not our thoughts, but the structure of our world. That's Marshall McLuhan, 1969, in the foreword to The Interior Landscape, the Literary Criticism of Marshall McLuhan. You could alter this also to provide some food or thought, such as, for the function of any given design is like the juicy piece of meat carried by the burglar to distract the watchdog of the mind. The larger point here, as relates to design, is that it can be very difficult to imagine what the effects of innovation will be. Speed is perhaps both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, slowing down allows us to stop and smell the roses. I live in the country now, but when I lived in the nearby town, I could walk to the post office in about 5 minutes to get my mail. It would seem both silly and wasteful to drive, right? A nice day, it's great to get outside and enjoy the quick walk up Main Street to the post office. The difficulty is that everyone else has the same idea. I run into Pat. I see Leslie sweeping the sidewalk in front of her shop. Friends at the table outside the cafe. A 5-minute walk turns into a half hour in the blink of an eye. I could have driven, but I'll choose to walk almost every time because of the quality of the experience. If I hadn't walked, I would have missed a lot. On the other hand, I'm reminded, as I often am, of how if you step into a bath that's too hot, you immediately pull out your foot and wait or add some cold water. But as they say, if you only raise the temperature of the bath water gradually, 1 degree at a time, you wouldn't know when to scream. I'm also thinking of how I write. I typed this speech, and when I'm writing prose, I usually actually type. As Truman Capote said of Jack Kerouac, that's not writing, it's typing. There are big differences between writing and typing, and I think part of it has to do with speed. I can type about twice as many words per minute as I can write, but I notice differences in the quality of my writing when it's with pen and paper or on a keyboard. I almost never type poetry. I've tried, but it doesn't work for me. Writing by hand, because it's slower, necessarily slows down your mind. If you're someone who finds their mind often races and you'd like to slow it down, try writing a page a day by hand. Doesn't really matter what you write, but maybe try writing letters to people. In fact, you don't even have to mail them, although I don't know anyone who doesn't like getting a letter in the mail. You can write letters to yourself even, for that matter. I've noticed a similar difference between reading on the page and reading on the screen. I tend to skim a lot more on the screen. I tend to read more completely from paper. These are just a few of the differences. There are always sacrifices to be made, services and disservices. When we optimize for speed and ease, we may sacrifice quality and depth. We may also gain things like some distance and objectivity. What is gained? What is lost? There are so many considerations when it comes to design beyond function and aesthetic. There's the matter of effect. What could go wrong is not usually a profitable question to ask, but it is a very worthwhile question to ask. I'm beginning with effect and working back to causes. Marshall drew something else from Poe, aside from this sent into the maelstrom, and that's from Poe's character Dupin, the prototype of the modern detective fiction hero, and the notion of working back from effects to causes. In the typical detective novel, you begin with a corpus delicti, or a murder in a body, and it is the job of the detective to pick up clues and reconstruct events in order to solve the mystery, to determine who done it. Quote, "It is now perfectly plain to me that all media are environments. As environments, all media have all the effects that geographers and biologists have associated with environments in the past. Environments shape their occupants. It is obvious that the user or content of any medium is completely conformed to the character of this man-made environment in which he operates. The medium is the message, because the environment transforms our perceptions, governing the areas of attention and neglect alike." That's from a piece called Postscript 1971, which was tacked onto the end of a piece called Education in the Electronic Age from 1967. And there, as in some other places, I've kind of taken a couple quotes from one document and squeezed them together. Maybe I'll make this available after the fact so you can go back and read it a bit slower. As Anne mentioned, I do this course on understanding media, and part of the beauty of it is being able to go through blocks of text very slowly and minutely with a lot of detail to take it a piece at a time. Because of time constraints today, we're just going to ram through a lot of it. Hopefully it's not too much. Much of McLuhan work in exploring and understanding the nature and effects of technologies rests on this word, medium. As we see from this excerpt, Marshall begins to look at technologies not so much in terms of isolated devices, but as complex, dynamic environments. A few years earlier, following Understanding Media in 1964, which was based on research and a report completed in 1960, Marshall wrote a paper called The Relation of Environment to Anti-Environment, dated November 1965, in which he wrote, "Any technology, any extension and amplification of human faculties, when given material embodiment, tends to create a new environment. This is as true of clothing as of speech or script or wheel." The essay goes on to say that our technological environments are as invisible to us as water is to fish, and that to be able to perceive the environment, we need to construct anti-environments. How do you notice water if you're the fish? It's very difficult to see a whole environment at once, but Marshall was always working to develop tools with which to do so. I believe one of the primary ways Marshall did this was by asking questions. The right question can be like having just the right tool at hand. It can save you a lot of time and effort. To back up for a second, it's helpful to remember that Marshall McLuhan was an English teacher specializing in modern poetry and a literary critic. He studied at Cambridge University in England under people like I.A. Richards, who were at the time, early 1930s, developing a new style of criticism known as the New Criticism or Practical Criticism. Their chief interest was less in meaning than effect, in what made a poem good or bad. Marshall, kind of brilliantly, transferred these sorts of ideas from the critique of poetry to the critique of culture and technology. Having spent the last 10 years or so getting more and more immersed in the work of my father Eric and grandfather Marshall, I've learned a few things about their methods. I should say that I come at the work from a slightly different perspective than they did. Marshall came at it from an intense curiosity of the nature of things and how they work through English literature, literary criticism, and academia. My father also had a similar approach. Myself, I wasn't much interested in school and never did go to university. I got into it less intentionally. My dad needed someone to travel with him, and that sounded good to me. And I found that, unlike when I was younger, what he was talking about actually made some sense now that I was a bit older. That was the beginning, and here I am today. My interest is in what's useful. I think we're at a place where we need to be smarter about what we do with technology. We live in a time where we can easily create devices which profoundly change who we are and how our cultures and societies function. Non-mythological Pandora's boxes. But like in that story, I'm left with hope because I believe in human ingenuity. Back to inventories. As it happens, I came across the following today because somebody posted a quote of a recent book which bore a striking resemblance. This is a longish quote, but with the accelerating stream of new media over the last few decades, we have created a new kind of culture, a culture of hunters of information. Back in the day when information was simply content, information gathering was the route to mastery. Now, information is environmental and gathering is pointless. All of it is instantly available everywhere. Navigation and hunting are principal skills of nomads. Like their Paleolithic ancestors, our neo-nomads go in electric form where the game is to be found. The simultaneous electric information environment takes the entire Neolithic age as its content and makes all of us hunter nomads and huntresses. Sorry, I messed that up. These are properly media ecological concerns. The first job media ecology has then is to study the new nomad as representing a form of culture. To this end, all modes of causality have to be brought to bear, particularly formal cause, specifically useful for the elucidating of environmental forms. And the procedure proper to formal cause, as it deals with simultaneous relations, is that of inventory. That was my father, Eric McLuhan, from a speech he gave in 2007. Some of you may have heard of one of the books Marshall McLuhan is most famous for, The Medium is the Massage, an inventory of effects. And we'll tell you, I never get tired of holding up exhibits. Here's the book here. Yeah, the title is The Medium is the Massage, but there's that little subtitle, an inventory of effects. And I think that subtitle gets overlooked, but it shouldn't. It's very important. If you want to take account of what you have, you make an inventory. If it sounds obvious, it's because it is. Inventories are great and often surprising. You can make an inventory of the contents of your purse, your room, your locker, and I'll bet you find things you didn't know or remember were there. And when you put them all together and look at the total picture, that will tell you other things. Figure and ground. Remember that environments are complex and dynamic, that is, changing things. In order to get a handle on something as big as the environment of effects associated with technologies, Marshall borrowed the terms figure and ground from early 20th century Gestalt psychology. There, the terms were used to describe the structure of visible phenomena, the parts of a picture, for example, foreground and background. Marshall borrowed the terms but expanded them and used ground interchangeably with medium or environment. I do this exercise with students of all ages, but it's most fun with the younger children because they're not old enough yet to know they shouldn't always try to have as much fun as possible in any given moment. Bless them. What we do is we get as big a surface as possible, a blackboard or whiteboard, and in the middle we write the figure. I like to use the smartphone as a figure to start because just about everyone has one and knows quite a lot about them. But you can use anything as your figure, such as anything you might design. With smartphone in the middle as our figure, sorry, you'll have to just try and picture this. With smartphone in the middle as our figure, I asked the class, now, what do you need in order for the smartphone to work? And I go around the class getting responses like electricity, power lines, chargers, batteries, and I put them together on this side of the board. I'll get other answers to do with materials and put them together somewhere else. I'll get things like money and finance associated things and put them together. During this process, we discover how all these different things relate to each other and form this environment with each part subtly connected to the other and in dynamic relationship as well. It can go on for quite a while and be a lot of fun, and just about everybody joins in to help fill in this picture, which makes it a good exercise. Eventually, when the board is really full and we're having a good time, I'll stop it and take it down a notch. I'll erase smartphone from the middle of the board, and I'll say to the kids, now, and this is the fun part, imagine you wake up in the morning and your smartphone, your alarm didn't go off. It doesn't work, and no one's smartphone will ever work again. And I pause and let that sink in. And there's usually an audible gasp, like an intake of breath, because these children, sometimes 10 years old, 9, 10 years old, can't imagine their lives without a smartphone. It wakes them up in the morning. It's the last thing they see at night. They rely on it throughout the day for things trivial and complex. It's how they relate to themselves, their peers, and the world around them. Without it, they are literally lost. This is also part of the ground, the part that's hardest to see because we're immersed in it. It's things like this which only become apparent when disaster strikes, when the power goes off or Facebook gets hacked. Marshall calls this breakdown or breakthrough, which is a phrase he borrowed from another psychologist, R.D. Laing. I'm willing to bet that if you asked any of the designers behind a smartphone if they anticipated a state of affairs like this, a classroom full of kids gasping incomprehensively and with a small amount of horror at the idea of not having their phones, whether they saw that coming, I bet they'd say no. Of course not. But I think, and it's easy for me to say, that designers need to consider these kinds of things, because the reality is that our world of the smartphone is unprepared for a world without the smartphone. Our world of the internet is unprepared for a world without the internet. The things we design, big or small, have big impacts. In conclusion, where are we at with time? We're good. In conclusion, on a more positive note, as I said, I have an abundance of hope, because I know that as much as we design ourselves into these messes, we can design ourselves out of them. This is the hope in Poe's story about the sailor, the hope of the work of people like Marshall and Eric McLuhan, who spent a good deal of their time poking around and trying to find out how things work and leaving us clues about how to do things differently. In the past, the majority of the effects of our technologies were unintended consequences. Tomorrow, with what we know today, we are in a position to potentially make most of the effects beneficial and intentional by design. Thank you. Really weird to do a speech on Zoom, but here we are. I'm glad, I think there are some people there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Andrew.
Oh, there's Omar. Hey.
Hey, everybody. I'm Omar Ansari, and I'll be your moderator for the rest of the evening. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat so that I can get them to Andrew. And thank you for that wonderful speech, Andrew. It's really great to just get a better understanding of the work of both your father and your grandfather and how it relates to some of the current conditions that we're facing in today's manifestation of technology, which are vast, if at all. So
thank you, Omar. I do have to say, you know, it is my take. There are, as somebody else said, many McLuhans. It kind of depends on who you're speaking to. So I definitely come at it from my angle, and other people will come at it from different angles.
Maybe I can get us started with a question in the meantime. And it comes from something that you mentioned during the talk, which was the suggestion that moving one's writing practice to pen and paper facilitates an intentional slowing down of one's thoughts, and how that interaction between a writer and their tool changes the nature of what they create.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just thinking, as we consider the effects of technology on our creativity, can you speak to your thoughts or concerns around the shift to digital ways of making?
Digital ways of
making?
Of making. Yeah, it's hard. It's easy to be too precious about what we know from growing up. You know, it's like a lot of people, when you say you prefer books over e-readers or whatever, think, oh, well, he's just old and stuff. But, you know, I spend a lot of time, I'm here in this converted barn, which has like 5,000 books in it that I inherited from my dad. And, you know, you get a feeling from a library that I don't think you get from browsing a hard drive, you know, or, you know, flipping through the books on your e-reader. I even sound like an old person talking about it like this, but, you know, there are advantages and disadvantages to both, you know, and as much as I love the feel of paper and books, it's also really handy to have a searchable PDF. You know, when I'm trying to find a quote or something from a book, I definitely make use of that. But I think for me, when I want a quality of experience, I tend to go slower. Faster can be sometimes a bit more efficient, or maybe thrilling even. Maybe it has something to say about how I grew up and where and when that I tend to enjoy the slow ride myself. As it becomes easier and more increasingly frictionless, to design on a computer screen, I think people will still do that quick sketch on a napkin, you know, because there's something about that tactility and hands-on and grabbing the first thing available that I think will be timeless.
So far, it seems to be. Yeah, I think back to my time at CCA, studying what is a very digital program, but starting off with drawing studios and figure drawing and an opportunity to spend a lot of time sketching and wondering, why am I doing this? I'm going to spend all my time on a computer screen. And now some years later, it's very clear why I was doing it. The way that those thoughts change once they become digital is incredible. They feel almost too fixed to have that fluidity that thinking really, I think, deserves. And that pen and paper, that napkin sketch really offers the kind of freedom of thought that design and design thinking, I think, needs to be a representation of the variety of thoughts that come up throughout the process, rather than what you can create in a digital space that becomes hardened so quickly.
Yeah, and again, I don't write things off, so to speak, unnecessarily. As I said, I've written poetry since I was a kid by hand, but I've also experimented with doing it on my phone. I did that for quite a while. And, it's almost a little bit like the difference in different poetic forms, writing to a rigid style like haiku, or writing more stream of consciousness, kind of flowing thought. You end up with a different product. And for myself, I've found that I end up with the poems I'm most happy with when I have a sheet of paper in front of me. The other thing that I find about paper that a screen hasn't given me yet is I can easily write, I can write 10 lines and fill this page, or I can write 100 lines and fill this page.
Yeah.
It's and with very little interaction to stop my flow of thought. I don't have to select font sizes and different fonts. I can make all those changes without thinking about them. And that's a big difference as well between the ease of use of paper and pen. But, I don't know if I were to train myself or be quicker on a keyboard or stylus, maybe I could do it better on a screen. I'm making myself sound hopelessly old, but
no, I think it's really relatable. It's something that I hope that kids are still being taught. Looks like we have a question from Jacob Powell saying, you mentioned a comparison between typing and writing. Do you have any thoughts on dialogue versus online dialogue like we're having here? I know many of the McLuhan's co-authored books were written through dialogue.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, actually, and it's one that I was noticing myself during this speech is how different a speech this is, having written it and read it, performed it, versus what I normally do in a small speech, which is I'll write down a dozen or so talking points and assume that I'll spend 3 to 5 minutes on each one. And, that's a half hour right there pretty easily. Um, there's different advantages, again, to come back to it, it's advantages and disadvantages. I'm able to do some things, having written the speech, that are more difficult to come across in dialogue. On the other hand, speaking just off the top of your head is a lot easier to connect with people. Then again, there's a big difference between speaking to 25 people on a Zoom call, where all I hear is the sound of my own voice in a room just filled with books, versus speaking to even like 5 people in a room where I have some biofeedback, right? Completely different. But to the question, what I think it was Jacob brought up was Marshall switched his style from writing to dictating, essentially. He carried on a huge correspondence in letters between people, thousands and thousands and thousands of letters, and it's ridiculous to think about how many letters he wrote and exchanged every day. I don't know if you've ever tried to keep up a written correspondence, but trust me, it's very difficult. Most people will drop off after 2 or 3 letters back and forth, even though they might have the best intentions. But Marshall had the luxury of a secretary. He'd lie back on his couch and dictate, and the secretary would type it up later, right? Much easier to just sign your name on it at the end. And he switched to this method for books as well. And the reason is the process of discovery that comes through dialogue. And a lot of times it was sort of Marshall speaking out loud with a few words here and there from somebody else to get him onto a different topic. But this is how Marshall ended up writing several of his books with co-authors. Was they would get together and discuss some things, and the co-author would make notes or maybe a recording and then go off and type them up. And they'd assemble a volume of material this way, which they and Marshall would edit down to something, and there you have a book. But again, coming back to the quality of the product, you get a much different book that way than just simply sitting down and writing. And I know a lot of musicians work this way as well. For example, there's a group called Broken Social Scene. They're kind of well known in Canada and I think internationally. And what they do, and a lot of bands do, is they'll just get together and jam and record it, and go back later and say, oh hey, that 30 seconds was pretty cool, let's develop that a little bit. And that's how you end up with songs, because you can come up with things improvisationally, which have a very different character than if you just sit down with an instrument and try and write out a song. I hope that answers the question a little bit.
We've got another one from Jen, who asks, beneficial and intentional by design. Love that closing quote as a guiding principle for anyone making things. Any thoughts on how to think through the potential impacts of design or idea?
Yeah. And I thought about going into this more. Of course, we didn't have a lot of time, but I would encourage you. I brought up figure and ground because that's a really basic and simple technique for getting at some of the effects of any technology. There is something that Marshall and Andrew McLuhan developed in the early 1970s called the tetrad. And this is really a whole other talk, and I'd love to come back and tell you about it sometime. But in response to Understanding Media in 1964, the quick story is that Marshall was asked to do a 10th anniversary edition. And instead of just writing a new introduction, a chapter or two, he decided to answer one of the main criticisms of the book, which was that it wasn't scientific. And that got him to thinking, well, fair enough. How do we make a scientific statement about media, about technology? What would laws of media look like a law of thermodynamics or relativity or gravity or anything else? What can we say about all media? Not just this medium and that medium, but all media. So he and my father set out to answer this question: what do media do? That is, what do all media do? Because these one medium, all media do all kinds of things, but long story short, they discovered that all media do at least 4 things. And that is, They enhance or they amplify some human function or ability. Uh, at the same time, they obsolesce or take over from something or push it aside to give it a new role. Uh, Also, at the same time, they bring back an older way of doing things into a new, do things in a new way.
Mm.
And uh, when you take the new form and you push it to an extreme, it tends to reverse its characteristics so that, um, when you create a super highway to ease the flow of traffic, if you put too many cars on the road at one time, you end up slowing everybody down and getting a traffic jam, even, or accidents or whatever. So they came up with these four things. They only found four things that they felt applied across the board, and they were always looking for exceptions to the rules or a new rule that applied everywhere. They only ever found four, which is why they called it a tetrad, because tetrad means a group of things. And this they called the laws of media, and they published. My dad managed to get the book published in 1988, though Marshall died in 1980. Anyway, this is they used displayed it as a series of questions. So when you look at any given technology, you can ask these four questions, and it can be a technology we have or a technology you are developing, something you are designing. You know that it's going to enhance some function, it's going to obsolesce something else, it's going to bring back something in a new way. And if you push it to an extreme, it's going to reverse its characteristics. So these are four things that can really help you look to what the effects of anything could be.
Thank you.
And
Yeah,
again, you can look that up. Laws of Media is a very difficult book to read. It's really dense, but there are other ways of approaching it, and maybe I'll even do a class on it someday.
I think that's a great tool and one that's incredibly relevant for today's making. So I look forward to applying it to some of the work I'm doing currently.
Cool.
We've got another question here from Kareem Yusuf, who says, could you please elaborate on the difference between medium is the message and medium is the massage in relation to the idea of medium is an environment?
Yeah. Well, that's fairly simple. As the story goes, and it sounds a little convenient to me, but anyway, as the story goes, it was supposed to be called "The Medium is the Message," and it was a typographical error that had the title be "The Medium is the Massage." And supposedly, because actually the funny thing about this book, "The Medium is the Massage," is it was, as the cover says, by Quentin Fiore, Marshall McLuhan. Quentin Fiore was a well-known designer, is a well-known designer. He actually only passed a couple of years ago. He was almost 100 years old, but and it isn't so much a McLuhan book as a Fiore and Agel book, because they kind of raided Marshall's files and illustrated them. Marshall didn't really have very much to do with the book, but anyway, supposedly it came back from the printer with this error, "The medium is the massage," but Marshall said, no, 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 I love it, because that's exactly it. The medium massages us and it lulls us into this kind of state where we're not aware of what's happening. Medium is the massage. That's perfect. So it's perfectly in line with this idea of a medium being an environment that we don't really notice too much of. It just works.
Thank you. It looks like we have one last question before we wrap from our own Helen Maria. And she says, I was struck by the impact of the exercise where you described asking children to imagine a future without their smartphones. And I can imagine that this would be equally effective at starting a critical discussion with college students. Can you share some of the ideas for how to wake up or other things that the younger children propose in response to your prompt? And I'll share that in the chat just so you can reread that.
Yeah, thank you. Let me I'll go over to the chat there. Way down at the bottom. Struck by the impact. I like the phrasing there. how to wake up or other things that the young children proposed. Yeah, it's such a great exercise, and I've done it for kids in grades 5 and 6, and I've done it in high school, and I've done it for fourth year university classes, and I've done it at the local library with adults up to senior citizens. Um, and as I said, the kids are the most fun because they're always looking to have fun, right? And to have a good time, especially when they're not supposed to be having one, like in school, right? And Marshall has a lot of quotes. There's a quote for every occasion. One of them is that, anyone who thinks there's a difference between education and entertainment doesn't know the first thing about either. Because the truth is, we have our most powerful learning experiences when we're not, at school or engaged in being educated or trying to learn something, right? It's like our hobbies are always the things we know most about because they're what excite us, what we have fun doing. So we don't realize all of a sudden we're an expert in something. Maybe it's only hip hop culture, but the effect is the same thing. That's why talking about smartphones or technologies like this is a good way to go because it's so relatable for them, and it's so immediate and powerful. And really, gosh, I should really do one of these classes and see if I can record it, because that moment when they picture themselves waking up tomorrow and there's no smartphones, the look of horror, and the classroom goes silent, where like a minute ago everybody was jumping in and laughing and yelling stuff out. And the contrast between the two situations is really remarkable, and it gets at the heart of this matter, which is that these things affect us so profoundly, emotionally. So many things are tied up in this that we didn't even talk about. It's enough for me in a situation like that to open a conversation, because kids like this have never thought about technology like this. They just use it day to day. They lean on it, they count on it, but they don't consider what it's doing to them, how it's changing their sense of self, their sense of identity, and not just their sense, but their identity, who they are. Who are they going to be tomorrow when they wake up and they can't turn to the device? They're going to be somebody very different, and it's honestly one of the big privileges of my life to go into a school class like that and have a conversation with a kid that can you imagine if all across the United States, Canada, the world, kids in grade school were having conversations like that? Imagine what our world would look like 10 years later when they're in charge, or 20 years later. So yeah, even here, it's always a privilege to come in and be able to speak with students and people and have conversations about design and technology and effects, and trying to do good.
Well, Andrew, I think that's a perfect place to end our conversation. And thank you so much for your time this evening, pushing through COVID to do no small feat and speaking for over an hour. Really appreciate everything that you've shared with us today.
Thank you,
And
Omar.
thank you to Nina for facilitating the conversation, and Anne for the introduction. This wraps our last installment of the design lecture series. If there's anything else that needs to be said, I will turn it over to the remaining panelists. But Andrew, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.